Excellent. Morning, folks. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. We're here for our Battle of Maryland Heights anniversary program. Just getting started. If you'd like to join us, certainly welcome that. Excellent. Where are you folks coming from today?
Harpers Ferry. Or like Bakerton.
Okay.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, welcome. Thanks for joining us. We got from Maryland, New Jersey, and local to the area. Very nice. All right, I'm from Pennsylvania originally, but I live in the area now. My name is Isaac. I'll be conducting our program, and my fellow Ranger Kristen will be accompanying us on the program, kind of bringing up the tail end of it. Where are you from originally?
I'm a military brat.
All right.
I'm from anywhere.
Yeah.
So,
Everywhere.
Right on.
Yeah, all around.
Everywhere in USA.
Yeah. As we get started, a few things about the hike itself. It's going to be steep and strenuous. We're headed up to the top of the mountain, and that's hopefully where we'll be concluding around noon, maybe a few minutes after. At that point, you'll have a couple of options. We'll be on a Blue Blaze trail, and it's on our park brochure. I have extra copies if anyone would like a brochure. But you can come straight back down. If you're done, want to get back as soon as you can, then you can go straight back the way we came, the most direct route here. That puts your total hike close to 6 miles. If you want to go further, and I'll be going a little further, out to the Overlook Cliff, I'll take the rest of the Blue Trail down to where it meets the Red Blaze Cliff Trail, go out to the cliff, and then come back down the mountain. You're welcome to join me in that. If you want me to keep talking, I can. If you just want to go out and enjoy the view, that's perfectly fine. That'll put your hike around 6.5 miles round trip, beginning and ending right here. It is going to be warm today. Supposed to get up to the mid to upper 80s. If you find, as we're getting to the latter half of our program, as we're getting closer to the Stone Fort, that it's more difficult than you anticipated, if you're running out of water, I have a couple small bottles of water, unopened, and I have one bottle of generic sports drink. So if anybody finds they're in real need of it, I have a little bit of extra water. If we're half hour in and you're out of water, you maybe want to run back here. But how are you folks today? Good. We're just getting started on our 9 a.m. program. We're going up to the Stone Fort at Maryland Heights. If you're here for that, if you looked it up, great. If you're not, you're welcome to join us if you want to. It will be a steep and strenuous hike, and the program's 3 hours. But you're welcome to hang out or just enjoy the view. So, as we get started on our program, I would like to ask a question of you all beyond where you're coming from. Are any of you currently working?
Yep.
Yeah? And what do you do for work?
I work in healthcare.
Healthcare?
Yep.
That's fun?
Sure is.
How about you?
Musical instrument retail.
Musical instrument retail, very nice. I played the drums for a good while.
Nice.
After college, kind of fell out of it, unfortunately. And how about you, sir? Besides primarily the channel? Okay. How about you folks?
Civil engineer.
Civil engineer. Oh.
In healthcare as well.
Okay. Nice. One second here.
Make sure they get out of the tunnel before the train comes through. In case anybody's in there.
Hopefully.
It is also there.
In your work, do you do most of your job by yourself? Do you ever work in groups, teams to do stuff?
Groups. Also solo, but lots of collaboration.
Okay. I know my dad was a nurse, and he worked in a little pod, as they called it. Of course, the pods kept getting smaller. But so yeah, sometimes you work a group project. We're talking about a group project today. The assignment is to defend Harpers Ferry. Literally, the assignment is you will not abandon Harpers Ferry without defending it to the last extremity. We're going to talk about how that went. And in talking about this, the reason why is because how this battle went on the Maryland Heights, that determined the fate of Harpers Ferry itself. And what happens here in Harpers Ferry, more broadly, determines the fate of the Maryland campaign in September of 1862. When the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, moved out of Northern Virginia, invaded Maryland. He was hoping that he could get into northwest Maryland, Hagerstown, or further west, or get to south central Pennsylvania. He was hoping that after a little while, the United States Army of the Potomac, which in the first week of September 1862 was firmly ensconced in the defenses of Washington, D.C. He's hoping that after he invades Maryland, after a few days, the United States Army will pursue him. They'll have to. And once he gets far enough north and west, far enough away from Washington, D.C., he can turn around and stomp on the United States Army. Win a big battle. That will put significant pressure on President Abraham Lincoln to negotiate a peace with the Confederacy. The spring and summer of 1862 in Virginia is a spring and summer of victory for the Confederacy. Victory on the Virginia Peninsula, and welcome folks who are just joining us. Victory on the Virginia Peninsula, victory in the Shenandoah Valley, victory at the Battle of Second Manassas in August of 1862. These victories are adding up, momentum is cresting for the Confederate States, and Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, says the time is right to invade the North. So the first week of September is when he does it. On the 6th, his men are getting to Frederick, Maryland, about 20 miles east of here. If you're coming from New Jersey, you probably drove by it, maybe stopped there. But that'll be the first place his army gets to, and he's looking on the map where to go next. He wants to fight the U.S. Army on northern soil. He wants to win. So he doesn't want to fight there or any closer to Washington, D.C. D.C. is that way, about 60 miles. So Frederick is 20 miles closer to D.C. than we are. Depending on which way you go, if you drive. Driving is a nightmare, and I don't recommend it. But, so he wants to go further northwest. He's looking at Hagerstown, Maryland. He's looking at south central Pennsylvania. Good places to get the Army of the Potomac strung out and make it easier to defeat in battle. But he's also looking on the map. How is he going to get supplies to his army? How is he going to get food to his army? Because the people of central Maryland, the first few days that his army has been in Maryland, have not exactly been the most welcoming. A lot of slammed doors, a lot of closed shutters as his men enter these little towns and then go into Frederick. So he's not going to get enough food from the people of Maryland to feed his army. So he's going to need the Shenandoah Valley. We're the northernmost tip of the valley, and that's the breadbasket of the Confederacy. So supplies are going to come from the valley through Harpers Ferry, and then north along the Potomac River to wherever his army is ending up on the other side of it, in Maryland. But obviously to do that, there can't be U.S. troops in the Shenandoah Valley or here in Harpers Ferry, but there are. There's, as far as he knows, maybe 5,000 men here in Harpers Ferry, United States soldiers. So he has to get rid of them. He knows there's a small garrison at Martinsburg, Virginia, and at this time there is no West Virginia. Keep that in mind. West Virginia doesn't exist as a separate state until 1863, about 9-10 months after the events that we're talking about. But there's a small garrison at Martinsburg. He's aware of that. There's a garrison here at Harpers Ferry. Both of them have to go before he can get too far into enemy territory, into Maryland or south central PA. So he draws up a plan, the Special Orders 191. And that plan will be to divide his army into 4 different forces with 3 of them, almost half of his army, 28,000 soldiers, headed toward the Harpers Ferry area, while the other column, essentially half the army under General Longstreet, is going to continue northwest toward Hagerstown. These orders, the timeline he establishes is September 10th to the 12th. That's when this is all going to happen. Part of his army is headed to Hagerstown. The other 3 are coming to Harpers Ferry and clearing out Martinsburg on the way. They are dispatching the U.S. troops here, destroying them, capturing them, otherwise breaking them up, and then they're going to rejoin with the rest of the army somewhere between here and Hagerstown on September 13th. So by the 12th, the battle's done here, and by the 13th, they're back together, at least toward the end of the day. That's Lee's plan. Special Orders 191, finalized on September 9th of 1862. There's General Lee, if you've not seen him before. Issues the orders. September 10th, his various forces start moving out. U.S. troops here in the area become aware that Confederates are coming towards them. And on September 11th is when you get the orders to the U.S. commander here, Colonel Miles, to hold to the last extremity. He's not ordered to try and retreat. He's not ordered to try and escape, as there are 3 columns of Confederates converging on Harpers Ferry. He's ordered to defend all places here. Do not abandon your post. So, on the 11th, Colonel Miles will send the final message to Baltimore, where his theater commander, John Wool, is, and to Washington via telegraph, and he will say, "My eastern front is threatened. My pickets at Solomon's Gap shelled out. The ball will open tomorrow morning. Force opposed to me is estimated at 10 regiments of infantry with proportionate artillery before dusk. Others have come into camp since. General White will abandon Martinsburg sometime tonight, and I expect this will be the last you will hear from me until this affair is over. All are cheerful and hopeful. Goodbye." That's his final message before the battle here begins. And it would begin on September 12th as the first column of Confederates begins approaching. They're under General Lafayette McLaws, and they're headed toward Maryland Heights. And that's where we're going to start heading to right now. We'll be crossing the bridge, getting to the other side, and taking about a half-mile walk up the canal until we get to a small bridge over the canal where the Maryland Heights trailhead is. Are there any questions before we continue on? All right, well, folks who just joined us a little later, my name is Isaac, and I'm conducting our program. If anyone has any questions as we walk in particular, I'm happy to answer them. And you're welcome to stay with me for the whole program. If at any point you find that, oh, I'm out of time, we got lunch plans, that's all right if you have to go. I won't cry. It's not till I get back to the office, so you want to see it. But additionally, I've got a little bit of extra water and 1 generic sports beverage. If anybody really starts to feel like they're out of water, they need hydration. And I've got a small first aid kit. If anybody scrapes a leg, gets a cut, I can help you out there. Anything more serious, I'm probably calling for backup. All right, if you'll follow me. As we were right at the point I mentioned about if you folks work, what you do. Do you folks currently work?
Yeah.
Social worker?
Accountant.
Sorry?
An accountant.
Accountant, okay. Good with numbers. All right. In your work, do you generally accomplish most of your work by yourself, or do you work in groups ever?
I'm a CFO. I got a whole group.
A team? Okay. As you work on a group project, I'd ask you to think about what types of people that you work with.
Oh my gosh.
It doesn't have to be specific people, but sort of the archetypes. As we think about group projects, I know I've worked on plenty of group projects, either in school or here for the park, and when different people come together to accomplish a single goal, you sometimes have these archetypes that show up. You got the go-getter who, you know, the minute after you get the assignment, is like, here's what you're doing, here's what you're doing. I've already started doing this. We're going to get this done 8 weeks before the deadline, and then we're going to be all set. You've got somebody like me who procrastinates, who puts things off to the last minute. You might not hear from me. I don't always communicate the best. I'll do my job, but maybe right at the end, which will make that first person very nervous. You'll have folks sometimes who maybe know what the assignment is and can do it, but for whatever reason, they're a little limited. They're like, well, I'm going to try and get this done, do the best I can. Maybe it doesn't always turn out. Sometimes you work with somebody who's brand new, who has never done it before, but they're super eager. They're like, yeah, I want to learn how to do this, how this goes. I want to contribute as much as I can. Some of the different people you might work with on a group project, and then you get every once in a while somebody who's like, yeah, you guys are got it, I'm not contributing. Good luck. A few of those people show up here in Harpers Ferry for the Battle of Harpers Ferry. The various archetypes, some folks who are gonna like, yes, here's the project, we're gonna do it. Folks who say, oh, well, you know, I'll try my best, I don't know how much I can do. And then there's some inexperienced folks who are like, well, you know, I want to learn, just don't put me in charge. That's going to be Colonel Eliakim Sherrill of the 126th New York, the largest regiment in the garrison here at Harpers Ferry. His regiment mustered in late July of 1862. So we're here in the second week of September of 1862. That's a period of 6 or 7 weeks that his men have been in the Army. And for the most part, they've had almost no basic training whatsoever. Colonel Miles, talking about another New York regiment here who mustered in at the same time, he said they never had a gun in their hands until the boxes were opened and the muskets issued to them yesterday. So, not exactly crack troops here in the garrison. Inexperienced, they've never fought before. Colonel Sherrill, the 126th New York, he's perfectly willing to do whatever is assigned. He wants to learn, but as he is dispatched to go to Maryland Heights with his men, he freely admits, I know nothing about military. He's a blank slate, but he's a patriotic individual, and he certainly wants to help. And there'll be Confederates, U.S. soldiers who get dispatched to Maryland Heights as it's threatened by the Confederates, which we'll talk about as we get up to that little bridge. Any questions before we continue on? All right. So, Confederates are headed to Harpers Ferry to capture or destroy the garrison here, commanded by Colonel Miles. Miles has been in the Army over 40 years, essentially his entire adult life. His first part of his career, his first military combat experience in the Mexican War, goes quite well. He's brevetted 3 times for his conspicuous gallantry on the battlefield. So his service record up to the Civil War is spotless, even shining. Exemplary, you might say. Civil War starts. Things don't go quite as well for Colonel Miles. He has a command of soldiers at the Battle of First Manassas in July of 1861, the Civil War's first big battle. And after the battle, officers would testify, fellow officers in the U.S. Army would testify that they heard Colonel Miles issue orders with slurred and distorted speech. They said that he swooned in the saddle, and they said at one point he may have even fallen off of his horse. In other words, they accused him of drunkenness. It's a serious charge to levy at a senior officer. The only step up after colonel was general, after all. So the U.S. Army is going to investigate the allegations. They convene a panel, inquire. They come back with a little bit of a shoulder shrug. Can't be certain of the circumstances. Now there's a good chance Colonel Miles was suffering from a condition that we would call today diuretic dysentery, leading up to First Manassas. It's no fun for anybody. So, understandably, he went to a doctor for a prescription to treat what was ailing him. And that doctor appeared to have prescribed a 3-part remedy, which consisted of mixing opium and quinine together and washing it down with brandy. A potent cocktail.
Slept well.
And yeah, probably slept great.
Yeah.
It's possible he was taking that leading up to the battle. Possible on the day of the battle itself. Can't be sure of that. But the Army looks at everything and they say, well, it's possible. It's also possible that Miles, being a colonel, was only 22 in the whole U.S. Army in 1861. He's one of them. He's been in the Army 40 years. That's long enough to make some enemies. It's long enough for a few majors to say, hey, I should be the colonel, not Dixon Miles. So, maybe people don't like him. Maybe he was a drunk, addicted to opium. Can't be positive. So the Army says, you know what? We'll send you somewhere more suited to your abilities. Harpers Ferry in the spring of 1862. Garrison duty. The troops sent to him are not going to be the finest, as I mentioned. A lot of new recruits. They're going to be called the Railroad Brigade. They're going to keep the railroads running. We walked over one railroad bridge. As we were walking to our right, we saw the foundations of the original Baltimore and Ohio Bridge. The B&O became maybe the most important transportation network in America during the Civil War. So Miles is sent here with troops to keep the B&O running. Make sure Confederate soldiers, guerrillas, partisans don't tear up the tracks, don't steal stuff off of the trains. As Colonel Miles says, the troops sent to him do not exist for the intention of fighting an army. Except that in September of 1862, a real army comes to him, and they're looking for a fight. Coming from 3 directions. One column is coming around from the west. They're going to Martinsburg first. They sweep out that garrison under General Julius White. 2,500 men out of Martinsburg, back toward Harpers Ferry. That's Stonewall Jackson, General Thomas Jackson's column of Confederates, 14,000 troops. There's another column coming around from the south. They recross the Potomac, they leave Frederick, go south. Over the Potomac, they're headed toward Loudon Heights. That's the second tallest mountain in Harpers Ferry, about 1,250 feet above sea level. And then the third column, General Lafayette McLaws, coming directly from Frederick toward Maryland Heights, where we're going. Tallest mountain in Harpers Ferry, 1,450 feet above sea level. As Colonel Miles freely admitted, the key to his whole position. Now, if you folks have been out west, if you've been to Colorado and California, Montana, you know that these are hills. They're not mountains. 1,450 feet above sea level, that's not a typo. There's not an extra zero. That's supposed to be on the end of that. But here in the east, these count as mountains. And Maryland Heights being the tallest point in Harpers Ferry, that matters. For defending the town, the bridges across the river, access through the gap, 60 miles downriver is Washington. The other way, Shenandoah Valley, the breadbasket of the Confederacy. And this point, Maryland Heights, is the key to it all, as the Confederates are aware. Now, they're expecting that as they get closer, that Colonel Miles won't stay here. The U.S. troops won't just sit inside this cage as the Confederates close and lock the doors around them. That would make no sense whatsoever. They'll try to escape. As General Lafayette McLaws said, it was doubtless assured that the enemy, upon hearing of our approach, would leave the place and attempt to escape. And the thought is that when they realize McLaws is coming from Frederick and they can't go that way, they're going to try to head west along the rail line. Then they're going to run headlong into General Jackson's column, and they're going to be destroyed. Battle over. Confederates move toward Hagerstown, join the rest of the army. Campaign continues northwest. That's the idea. And this is McLaws here, impressively bearded, but so were many of the general officers in the Civil War. Never bring a mustache to a beard fight, as they say. But he's got over 12,000 soldiers delegated to him, of which 2,000 are the ones that we're going to be talking about. Because they are approaching to actually fight U.S. troops at the crest of Maryland Heights, and they're coming towards Solomon's Gap. It's about 4 miles along this ridgeline, 4 miles away, a little northeast of here. They have to get through Solomon's Gap and then come along the ridge here to Maryland Heights. Now on our hike, we'll have, for much of it, a nice wide, obvious trail. As we get further up on the Blue Blaze Trail, it's an old military road. First a charcoal road, then a military road in the Civil War. And it's not the best trail in the world, I'll be honest with you folks. But it's definitely not the worst. We're not scrambling over rocks or anything. And for the most part, it's obvious where we're going the whole time. The trail the Confederates have to take to get from Solomon's Gap to here is not that. They're moving here starting on September 12th is when they get to the base of Solomon's Gap. And they get up into it. There are a few U.S. Troops there, skirmishers, brief exchange of gunfire, U.S. troops retreat. And then McLaw's men, the Mississippi Brigade and the South Carolina Brigade, are moving toward the crest of Maryland Heights. Now, McLaw's aide, Captain Henry King, said that they were moving through, quote, almost impassable woods, rocks, no road, blind path, and no path. Another soldier in the 7th South Carolina Regiment, he said, soon the dim path we were following disappeared amid the rocks and precipices. So difficult and intricate was the passage along the mountain that Company A got lost and did not reach us until we camped at night. So they don't have a great trail to follow, probably a deer trace at best that they're moving along. In the ridge, there's a lot less trees than there are today. A lot of them were cut down before the war for the various industries in Harpers Ferry. But there's a second growth, there's a lot of vines, all sorts of little shrubs and bushes coming up that make it extremely hard to follow a real trail. And they're, of course, in Civil War uniforms. They have leather-soled shoes. They got 50-pound packs, for the most part, on their backs. They're not like lightweight, breathable fabrics that we have today. Jean wool, some cotton, but a lot of wool. Not the best in September, on a day like today, which it would have been back in 1862. So it's not a whole lot of fun going that day, and periodically they're getting fired at by U.S. troops who stop, turn around, they're just trying to delay the Confederates' approach. So it takes them about 8 hours to get that 4 miles along the ridge till they're at the top of Maryland Heights and almost in position to attack the U.S. troops. Now, Colonel Miles has a portion of his force. In total, he has much more than Lee anticipated. Not 5,000 troops as Lee had thought, which he wrote about. There are, in fact, almost 15,000 soldiers. But the bulk of them are on Bolivar Heights, 2 miles west from town. And Colonel Miles thinking, if Harpers Ferry gets attacked, it's not going to be from the north. That's friendly territory. It's going to be from the west and south. That's the Shenandoah Valley, the breadbasket of the Confederacy. So his defenses are all set up to repel an attack from the west. And in fact, Stonewall Jackson, in May of 1862, had threatened the town from the west, from the Shenandoah Valley. So they had raced more soldiers here. They raced artillery here. They put this artillery, guns, really large guns that are usually found on ships or in coastal forts to sink ships. They put them up about halfway up the slope of Maryland Heights. That's our next stop, the Naval Battery, as they called it. Some super heavy guns. There's 2 9-inch Columbiads. They fire 70-pound cannonballs. And there's a 5-inch Parrott rifle, which fired 50 to 60-pound shells. And they can fire for a couple miles out over Harpers Ferry. So they are fearsome. They're about halfway up the western-facing slope, ideally situated to bombard attackers coming from the west or anyone who shows their face on Loudon Heights. Miles has not put anyone on Loudon Heights, but initially he has about 1,150 men here on Maryland Heights. In command will be Colonel Thomas Ford. Ford will make his headquarters at the Naval Battery. Now, Ford is somebody, if we're thinking of our group project, who should know what they're doing, who says, okay, I'll do this task. But have you ever had somebody on your project who you thought you could rely on, but then when the deadline comes, they're like, oh yeah, I don't have anything. That can happen. Sort of happens here with Colonel Ford. Colonel Ford's not in the best shape leading up to the Battle of Harpers Ferry. That's why he doesn't go up to the crest. He has a condition called a fistula. Now, if you don't know what that is, I encourage you not to look it up. Don't Google it. Just trust me that you don't want to know what it is. The only way I'll describe it is it makes it very uncomfortable to sit down. To walk, it's not great. Certainly riding in a horse, on a horse, in a saddle, terrible, not good. So, he had that condition. He's in charge of the defense of Maryland Heights. Colonel Miles places that trust in him. He has this condition, this fistula, and he says he's going to do his best, essentially. But as high as he'll go is the naval battery halfway up the slope. That's where we're going to go now and talk about how he was going to make his defense. You folks have any questions? All right. As we walk, maybe try and put yourself back in time as a Civil War soldier. Think about hiking this trail with leather-soled shoes and wool coat and pants. These pants actually are mostly wool, so I'm getting a little bit of it. As we walk up to the naval battery, I just ask you folks to think about what the qualities are of a good leader. If you've worked on a project and you weren't in charge, what were things a good leader did to manage the group, or maybe what were things that a bad leader would do? If you have that experience, I'll ask you about it later. If you don't mind sharing, you don't have to, but we'll talk a little bit about the leadership qualities of the officers that were stationed up here. How's everybody feeling so far? We're doing okay? Excellent. So we'll go up a little further to the naval battery, just a couple hundred yards. This is, I have to admit, the easier part of the hike. It will get steeper as we go up the Blue Blaze Trail toward the stone fort. That's a little bit like a treadmill. It seems like sometimes where you know you're putting your feet in front of each other, but it doesn't really feel like you're going anywhere. But as we were mentioning, just as we were walking up here, at least we don't have any cannon that we have to drag up. At different points in the war, soldiers had to drag up cannon. They were too heavy for the horses and mules to do it. And later in the war, they emplaced a 100-pounder Parrott at the crest of Maryland Heights. That rifled cannon, the tube alone weighed 9,600 pounds. And then each shell, as the name suggests, was 100 pounds. So you had to bring up the ammunition too. Not a fun time. Well, if you'll follow me. So, if anyone would care to share, what are some qualities of a good leader? If you're working on a group project, what do you want to see in the leader? Or if you're the leader, what do you want to demonstrate?
Motivation.
Motivation, okay.
No whining.
No whining. All right, no use complaining, you got to get it done. Any other folks?
It's knowledgeable.
Somebody who's knowledgeable, knows what they're doing. You'd hope so.
Effective communication.
Effective communication, there you go. So somebody who communicates what the assignment is, somebody who listens when you talk back to them, like, here's my thoughts on the assignment or on what I'm supposed to accomplish. Great qualities of a leader. Communication, of course, is essential. Some of these qualities were not quite present for the defense of Maryland Heights. So Colonel Ford is in command of defending Maryland Heights, initially about 1,150 men. In the days leading up to September 12th, when it was clear the Confederate Army had invaded Maryland and they might be headed toward Harpers Ferry, Colonel Miles, of course, had been ordered to hold to the last extremity And he had been ordered to prepare for the battle. In particular, everybody knew Maryland Heights is very important. So General John Wool, the theater commander, the district commander as they called it, in Baltimore, he sent a message to Colonel Miles. He said, construct a blockhouse on top of Maryland Heights, a big fortification for defending it. And Colonel Miles just didn't do that. Colonel Ford here, he says, okay, you want me to defend Maryland Heights? Well, I have to make fortifications up at the crest. I gotta clear trees, I gotta dig trenches, I gotta make defensive lines, breastworks to protect my people, to make it a strong position. So I need lots of tools and stuff to do that. Colonel Miles sent him a total of 10 axes. That's it. He's got over 1,000 men. It's one axe for every 100 men. That's it. Colonel Miles just refused to do anything more than that. No idea why. Then Ford says, well, I need artillery up there. We've got some here at the Naval Battery. We're not taking those any further up, but we have field artillery, which could be useful if we could put some artillery at Solomon's Gap. That's where the Confederates are going to come from to get onto the ridge and threaten Maryland Heights. So we should put some guns there. Colonel Miles says, no, won't do it. So Ford's like, okay, well, you want me to do this part of the assignment? I do need more artillery. So me and my artillery officer, McGrath, we agree that we need field artillery at least at the crest of Maryland Heights at a place called the Lookout, because there was a signal station up there. So I need some guns to take up there. Colonel Miles says no. He replies, in fact, if Ford and McGrath got their way, quote, we would have all the artillery at Harpers Ferry on Maryland Heights. That might not necessarily have been a bad thing. But Colonel Miles, from what we know, was a very literal person when he received orders. A strict constructionist, as you might call it today. He doesn't interpret anything. He does literally what you say. And his orders say to defend Harpers Ferry to the last extremity. Not Maryland Heights, but Harpers Ferry. So he might not necessarily view Maryland Heights as a place to put all his artillery. But Colonel Ford is saying, hey, this is what I need to do that. Finally, September 10th, Colonel Miles says, all right, I'll give you two guns. Two 12-pound cannon. They fire 12-pound balls. The cannon themselves are almost 2,000 pounds. So he gets two of them, and then September 11th, two more. Those guns are brought as far up as right here, the Naval Battery. And then they don't go any further. Why? We don't really know. It's just this is as far as they got. Maybe the men got tired, whatever. Colonel Ford, maybe his fistula is flaring up. In any case, the guns just sit here. And we're only about halfway up the slope. We've got another mile of walking uphill to get up to close to where the battle happens, to the lookout. And for whatever reason, no artillery gets up there in time. Now, Colonel Ford, he's got kind of an amalgam of troops. He has the 32nd Ohio, that's his unit that he commanded coming here to Harpers Ferry. He's going to stay here in overall command of the whole defense. So a junior officer, Major Sylvester Hewitt, is going to command the 32nd Ohio, and they're mostly going to be up at the crest of Maryland Heights. So Hewitt is going to be in command at the lookout, basically where the battle happens. Then there's some Maryland Potomac Home Brigade troops. The 1st Maryland Potomac Home Brigade, there's the 5th New York Heavy Artillery. Captain Eugene McGrath is in charge of that. 7th Squadron Rhode Island Cavalry, 1st Maryland Cavalry, a detachment. Just a kind of an amalgam of troops. On September 12th, Colonel Miles says, okay, you can have some more men, because Ford is saying we need more of everything if we're going to defend Maryland Heights. We've got good intelligence that significant amounts of Confederates are in the valley beyond, the Pleasant Valley, and they're coming this way. They're headed towards Solomon's Gap, and on the 12th, they're already clashing a little bit. So they have an idea that the significant attack is going to happen on Maryland Heights. So Colonel Miles sends a few more men. He sends most of the 39th New York Infantry, the so-called Garibaldi Guard. A lot of European immigrants in that regiment. Their major is Hugo Hildebrandt, kind of a revolutionary soldier, fought in multiple revolutionary conflicts over in Europe. And then Miles sends a couple companies of the 115th New York, and initially, right in the morning, the 126th New York Regiment, Colonel Sherrill's regiment, is supposed to be headed up the mountain. Here's Colonel Sherrill, but they don't. For some reason, Ford says, actually, I don't want those guys. He's been saying he needs more men, he needs more of everything, and then Colonel Miles says, here's the biggest regiment in the garrison, over 800 men, and Ford says, no, not them. 126 New York, I mean, they know nothing. As Colonel Eliakim Sherrill said, he knows nothing about military. They've never fought before. They've never seen the elephant, as they said in the Civil War. So he doesn't want them, but then by 3 p.m. he changes his mind. He's like, all right, I'll take them. So they're going to start up the mountain on the 12th. Ford will send more couriers, and then Major Hewitt will come down the mountain that evening to go to Miles to request reinforcements in person to impress him of the severity. So at that point, they have a good idea that the Confederates are in force. They've been skirmishing back and forth on September 12th. Now the Confederates are close enough that they can hear the men talking. They can get an idea of how many, multiple thousands, and they know a big fight is coming. So we need more of everything. Miles, they wake him up out of bed. He's a little startled, but he's like, oh, okay, this is very serious. I'll send you 2 more regiments right at daybreak. I'll send you 2 more artillery pieces, and you'll be able to defend Maryland Heights. Miles goes back to bed. Hewitt goes back, reports to Ford, and back up the mountain. Not really a fun time doing that late at night, but thinking they got everything they wanted. Excellent, wonderful. Well, September 13th at daybreak, right as the sun comes up, there are no regiments moving. Nobody's even really up out of their camps, getting ready to come up Maryland Heights. Why? Again, we don't really know. There's a lot of questions here. We'll get to why there's so many questions toward the end of the program. But Company H and I, the 1st Maryland Cavalry, will be headed up under Captain Charles Russell. He'll get here to Colonel Ford. Ford says, go report to Hewitt up at the lookout on top of the mountain. There'll be 3 companies of the 39th New York that are sent up. Colonel Ford had retained the bulk of the 39th down here. In fact, as the battle begins up there, there's about 850 men here who are just kind of hanging out. Then Ford, 7 a.m., sends an adjutant to Colonel Miles, more reinforcements. Gets there at about 8 o'clock. Miles says okay. He sends Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Downey's 3rd Maryland Potomac Home Brigade to head up the mountain. So some reinforcements will be coming. Where will they be going is the question. Colonel Ford has moved his troops all around. But up on the crest, they have a skirmish line, which is very close to where the Confederates are. They have several companies there. Behind that skirmish line, they have an abattis, a batis, if you prefer, but a bunch of felled trees. They sharpen the stumps, point them outward, and it's an obstacle that attacking soldiers have to navigate before they can get to your defenses. Slows them down, breaks them up, helps out what you're trying to do. There's about 8 companies, eventually maybe 15, or not 15, sorry. We have an accountant here, I'm not. Companies KB, oh no, actually it's about 12 or 13. 1,150 men eventually are up at that abattis. Behind them is a defensive line, an actual breastwork, prepared fortifications. There's some troops there. At the lookout, there's a few companies just hanging out there. On the southeast slope of Maryland Heights towards Sandy Hook, Maryland, there are several companies, and there are, let's see, about 9-10 companies down here. There's 850 men here. The big battle is going to happen, and they know it's going to be at the lookout. They've already encountered the Confederates. They've already exchanged fire. There's already been casualties, and they know that's where the main brunt of the assault is going to happen. There's 850 men out of a total complement now of a little over 2,000. 850 are here. Why are they here? Again, don't really know. Ford didn't send them up. He had them here. So when the battle begins, it'll occur a little bit after daybreak. Confederate skirmishers will move out ahead, and they'll encounter the skirmish line of the U.S. defenders there. They'll fire back and forth a little bit. One of the companies at the skirmish line of U.S. troops is the Company B of the 126th New York. So this regiment, none of them have ever been in combat before. Most of them didn't even know how to load and fire their weapons. Now they're going to be their first taste of combat. They fire back and forth with some of these Confederate skirmishers. A sergeant in another unit gets hit in the thigh. Looks a little nasty. It's bleeding a lot. Some of the men of Company B, the 126th New York, are a little shaken up by that, and they waver. Start to head for the rear. Captain Charles Russell is up there. He gets some other officers, rally the men. Say, no, no, back on the line. This is what happens in combat. Get used to it. The Confederates they're skirmishing with, the 7th and 2nd South Carolina Regiment, they fall back. They're just probing the defenses and seeing what sort of strength is ahead of them, what they're going to have to overcome. So they fall back. Well, Company B of the 126th New York, this is their first time in battle. They see Confederates going backwards. They say, yeah, we won, we did it. There's a huge cheer across the line. That tells the Confederates a better idea of how many men are on the line, because they can tell by the volume of the cheers. And there's about a half-hour lull. It's a little after 7 a.m. that this starts. At 7:50 a.m., they hear a long roll begin and a shouted order of forward. And then, as Charles Russell says, we could hear them tramp through the alders and undergrowth. When that becomes apparent to their ears, that the Confederates are now launching a real attack, Company B breaks, heads for the rear. They're out of here. The whole skirmish line comes unglued with that. And they got to fall back to a few hundred yards to the abattis, this cut log fortification. So they all fall back there. Some of them just keep on running. And a little trickle starts of men in blue coming down the mountain and coming past here at the Naval Battery, because the good trails, the roads, generously defined, come right by this, Colonel Ford's headquarters. So we start seeing men trickling down the mountain a little after 8 a.m. Now the main assault will be the 7th and 8th South Carolina Regiments in General Joseph Kershaw's South Carolina Brigade. They are going to be the ones who have to move forward and do the real work. As they advance, the terrain is pretty narrow. On their left, on their right, the U.S. soldiers' left, there's a ledge of rock, and the 8th South Carolina is pushed out of line by that ledge of rock. They can't form one long line to launch the attack. So it'll be Aiken's 7th South Carolina, Colonel D. Wyatt Aiken's 7th South Carolina, assaulting the abattis. And then the Mississippi Brigade, under General Barksdale, they're deployed down the eastern slope on the left, the United States right. There's not much they can do, apparently, due to the terrain. It looks too precipitous. They can't come around the flank, at least not very easily. So it's these South Carolina troops almost alone, one regiment, a few hundred men facing over 1,000, or what should be 1,150 at the abattis. Now, as they come up, normally what you're going to do, experienced soldiers, they're going to fire by volley. They're all going to have their guns loaded. They're going to wait for a command, ready, aim, and they're all going to fire at the same time. Massive wall of lead is going to go downrange, and that is going to extract a heavy toll on the advancing enemy. That, however, requires discipline and experience. You got to sit there and wait. You're not firing. You can see the men coming. Those men want to kill you, and you're sitting there, your gun loaded, and you're waiting for orders. You're waiting till they get closer. So it takes some discipline to do that. Many of the soldiers here don't have that discipline. 126 New Yorkers never done this before. Many of the men, they don't have great leadership. So instead of a fire by volley, it's fire at will. So just shots here and there are coming down range. That lasts for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then the 126 start to waver. One of their senior officers, Major Baird, who's supposed to be leading and inspiring his men, he is seen ducking behind trees, just trying to stay off the line, out of the line of fire. He is not there exhorting his men, encouraging his men. He's not doing really much of anything, except it looks like hiding. So there's some wavering. Some troops are hit, some casualties, and men start falling back. The break spreads around 8:15. There's a general order to fall back. Nobody's really sure who gave that order to fall back from the abattis, but it happens. People heard it, people start moving in larger numbers, and then everybody's like, well, if they're going, I gotta go. One soldier in Company F of the 126 New York thought the order to fall back was strange, but as he said, but 'twas not ours to reason why. So they all fall back to the main defensive line, the breastwork. Hugo Hildebrandt, leading the 39th New York, later insisted his men were standing firm. The 32nd Ohio, they were standing firm on the line. It's those New Yorkers who ran and panicked. But there's pretty good evidence that everybody broke a little bit. But the men get back to the breastwork. Some of them try to keep going. They're unnerved. It's their first experience in combat, so they're not going to stop a couple hundred yards away. They're just going to run the whole way down the mountain. Luckily, Colonel Sherrill gets there before most of the men, draws his revolver, and he says, you're not going any further. We're holding the line here. But some men leak through. They can't stop everybody. Some men just keep running, and you're not going to shoot them in the back. So this little trickle keeps coming down from the lookout. Colonel Aiken, the South Carolina commander, his men pursue closely. They're racing after the U.S. soldiers as they fall back from the abattis. But then they see that they hit this breastwork, that they have good cover. So the South Carolinians hold up. And they're like, we need to reform, reorganize. Those South Carolina troops and the Mississippians that are part of this as well, they're mostly veteran regiments. They've fought in battles before. They know what they're doing. Their leaders are experienced. For the most part, their leaders have risen up through the ranks. They were not appointed in charge. So they know what they're doing. They stop. They say, we're not just going to run headlong into this defensive fortification. So they pull back. Losses so far are low, some casualties. Not a whole lot, but they're going to hold up. They're going to reform for the main assault. Down here at the Naval Battery, Colonel Ford, he doesn't know what's going on up there. Not really. It will take us probably 45 minutes to walk up there. And we have good shoes, we have water, good packs, trekking poles, some of us. They don't. They have some horses, they can go up and down the mountain, but still there's a huge lag time between a report, leaving the lookout, getting to Colonel Ford, and then his response getting back up, probably at least an hour. So that means the fog of war is pretty heavy here at the Naval Battery. Ford, immediately, as the men start going by, he sees 126 New York soldiers. They have almost spotless blue uniforms because they're brand new. It says 126 New York in clear letters right on their hats. He sees that, this stream coming down the mountain. And between 8:30 and 8:45, he's like, I give up. It's too hard. We can't do anything. He sends a message to Colonel Miles. The 126 New York has given way and straggling through the woods. All our forces are falling back. He has no evidence. We have no evidence that he got an actual situation report from Major Hewitt at the lookout. He does order a few companies of Downey's 3rd Potomac Home Brigade up the mountain, 3 more companies up there, but it appears by about 8:30 or maybe 9 o'clock, Ford is convinced that they've already lost. He's got a couple obstacles that have just been thrown up in his path, and he's given up on the project. Like, I'm out of here, it's impossible, can't be done. Miles gets the note. He sends another regiment, the 115th New York, to head toward Maryland Heights. He encounters stragglers and guys retreating down the mountain as he comes up to see Colonel Ford. At this point, what he has seen is that Colonel Ford has given up and troops are retreating down the mountain. The main battle for the breastwork, the main defensive fortification on top of Maryland Heights, that battle has not even begun. Ford's already given up on the issue. I don't know if you folks have ever worked with somebody like that on a project where, oh, this is a little more difficult than I thought it was, or one unexpected obstacle comes up and then they're like, yep, it's impossible, we can't get it done, oh well. But that's kind of Colonel Ford, unfortunately. But the battle was not over. It had not even really begun, but it would soon. And as we walk up the mountain, we'll be taking several more breaks as we walk up and get to the stone fort, where we'll talk about the real battle for Maryland Heights. Are there any questions before we continue on? Okay, if you follow me, we right now are about where President Lincoln made it up to. He was going to review the troops. The U.S. Army was here in October of 1862, a few weeks after the battle, and Lincoln came to review the troops, and he was going to see all the different spots they were at: Bolivar Heights, Camp Hill, and Maryland Heights. There's troops up at the crest. So he was going to come up and review the troops. As far as we know, he got to about here, and then he decided they're probably fine and turned around. Lincoln, relatively in shape for his day. He was not about to go the whole way up like we are. But we are through much of the worst of the climbing. There is a bit more that's fairly steep, but it's going to start getting a little less, and then we'll get close to the crest of Maryland Heights, and it'll be relatively level when we're on top. So it will get a little easier, but for the time being we are still climbing another couple hundred yards or so.
You have a knot preventing you from tying your shoes.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and head on, if it's all right with you folks. Okay. Good spot, grab a little bit of water, and we're right at a charcoal hearth, flat spot up there. These mountains were combed in the late 1700s, early 1800s for hardwoods to cut down and reduce into charcoal for iron furnaces in the area. So there were a lot of colliers going through, and that's the origin of the trails we're hiking. They were military roads in the Civil War. The military improved them, generously defined, from the old charcoal roads, the carts going back and forth, carrying the wood and then carrying the charcoal down the mountain. So they would cut down a whole bunch of hardwoods. They'd make a giant hearth, sometimes like 30 feet across, where they'd stack the wood very carefully. They'd have a fire in the middle, a hot fire, and then they would cover it in dirt and other material so that it would reduce down. It would limit oxygen so the wood wouldn't combust, but it would superheat and reduce down and make charcoal. So that's how we got a lot of these trails, and which the military improved upon somewhat to move men and artillery. I think we can head on if we're ready. I think we're going to go a little bit further up. The trail is relatively flat until we get to some steps. We'll go up about a flight of steps, and then we'll be at just about the highest point on the trail, a little over 1,450 feet above sea level. We started our journey at about 280 feet above sea level, so about 1,100 plus vertical rise. We've conquered the mountain, but we'll find out if the mountain is to be conquered by the Confederates. As we get up, we won't be right at where the battle happened. We're a few hundred yards away. The battle happened largely on what is today private property off the trail, but we'll be at roughly where the lookout was, a U.S. signal station, and the spot where Major Hewitt remained for the duration of the fighting. Major Hewitt is supposed to be in charge of the battle up here on Maryland Heights. He never actually goes to see it. He spends the whole time several hundred yards in the rear, and it's not like they have radio communications or drones orbiting overhead. He's watching footage of anything. He's just watching as men leap back through the trees. And Colonel Ford, of course, never goes further than the naval battery. So we'll talk about what happens as we continue on. Now we've conquered the mountain. There's a few spots further on where we go very slightly up, very slightly down as we walk along the crest here. But we've done a solid 95% of the hard work here. If you go down to the overlook and then come back, there's a little more climbing involved in that, but all the real tough stuff we've just finished. So congratulate yourselves on that. We passed some breastworks and fortifications, and then we'll go up a little further along the trail to where the lookout was located, and we'll talk about what happens. Just as a refresher, when we left the naval battery, Colonel Ford had largely already given up. It was probably not even 9:30. The battle for the breastwork had not happened yet, but he's convinced they've already lost. It's not great, but he's sent several companies of the Maryland Potomac Home Brigade up here to Maryland Heights. Colonel Downey is going to come up with them, Lieutenant Colonel, in charge of the regiment. He has some experience. He knows, a little bit about what he's doing. So Colonel Sherrill, who's brand new, never done this before, Downey's going to be like an experienced person who can kind of, who knows what he's doing. So as you're, if you're working with somebody brand new on a group project, you hope somebody can kind of take them under their wing, make sure they're doing the right thing, make sure they're staying on task and on target. And that's sort of what Downey will do. But together, they'll largely manage the fight at the lookout, or at the breastwork, because Major Hewitt, who's technically in charge, who's Colonel Ford's direct subordinate, he just never leaves the lookout. For whatever reason, he feels his services are best utilized there, several hundred yards back from where the actual fighting is happening. But that fight will begin around 9:45. That's when the order to attack will begin, and we'll head over to the lookout and we'll talk about it. Looking east here, and a little south down the Potomac River, there's a bridge way out there in the distance. That's in Brunswick, Maryland, crossing over to Lovettsville on the other side. If anybody wants to grab a seat on a rock somewhere, the most comfortable looking one, feel free. We'll talk here about how the real battle for Maryland Heights, how it went. It's about 9:45 a.m. when the general order goes out for an attack. The Confederate commander supervising the attack, General Joseph Kershaw, will order the 7th and 8th South Carolina to carry the works. If I can get them here. So, post-war picture, Colonel D. Wyatt Aiken, commanding the 7th South Carolina Infantry. If you can't tell, it's from after the war. And they'll be making the main assault along with Colonel John Hennigan's 8th South Carolina Infantry. And I have this extremely clear picture of Colonel Hennigan. It's a little pixelated, but they'll be in charge, and their regiments are going to bear the brunt. The terrain is such that the Mississippi Brigade Barksdale soldiers can't really get into a position to support, and the other two South Carolina regiments, the 2nd and 3rd, are going to be behind in reserve. So the 7th and 8th are going to be coming up against the breastwork, which would have been a few hundred yards that way, a little bit off of park property. But this would have been about where the lookout was, about where Major Hewitt, who's supposed to be in charge of the battle, is commanding. So around the same time as the orders to assault the works go out is the 3rd Maryland Potomac Home Brigade and Lieutenant Colonel Downey's men arriving online. Now at the breastwork, theoretically, based on all the men who have been posted up here previous and then the reinforcements set up, there should have been about 2,000 men defending the breastwork. Best we can figure, there were maybe 1,000 at that point. The other 1,000 men, where are they? Well, they're kind of all over the place. Some of them are streaming down the mountain. So maybe 1,000 men, about parity with the roughly 1,000 men of the South Carolina Brigade. They have the defender's advantage. Theoretically, they're very well situated to hold off the Confederates. As the attack begins, Colonel Downey is essentially going to link up with Colonel Sherrill. Sherrill has no idea what he's doing, but he's basically, Downey's like, okay, you command that side of the line, I'll command this side of the line. Ideally, Major Hewitt would be, 10 yards behind them, coordinating them both, but he's here, probably a quarter mile or more away. He's not particularly interested in being within musket range. But you do have men hiding behind cover. We had a question as we were getting here, and they're not just standing in line shoulder to shoulder. Part of that shoulder to shoulder idea is to mass your fire, because at least leading up to the Civil War, most weapons used by soldiers are smooth bore. The inside of the barrel is smooth, so the projectile bounces around in there. It's not very accurate. The effective range of a Revolutionary era musket is maybe 100 yards. So if you don't have all the men together firing at the same time, it has little effect on the enemy. But when you have them all together, they all fire at the same time, that's when you get the biggest impact. And that does stay true in the Civil War, even though we're switching to rifles, which can fire 200 or 300 yards. But cover, of course, is a good thing to have. And they do have cover. Downey and Sherrill are going to be in charge, and they're going to try to manage the defense. As the attack begins, Captain King, that aide we introduced way at the beginning of the program, he's going to remark that then began a terrible engagement of small arms. These Confederates have to get over the abattis. They have to traverse over 100 yards of open ground to get to the breastwork, where the U.S. defenders are located.
So, question for you. On the other side
Yes.
of the breastworks here, did they clear all that out so
Yes.
it was an open field that they could see them coming across?
Yes, essentially.
And then the abattis was on the other side of the field?
Yeah, with the 10 axes they had, they were able to clear like 100-yard swath between the breastwork and the abattis. So you like clamber over these logs, trying not to get cut, because they sharpen the ends, and then you're getting shot at.
Shoot you from the other side of the rock wall.
Yes, essentially. It's not a whole lot of fun.
would think there was no way they could lose.
Yeah, the Charleston Daily Courier, a correspondent, said a tremendous fire of musketry was received by our boys. And Captain Charles Russell of the Maryland Cavalry, he testified that the 7th and 8th South Carolina made 3 separate assaults, and that they essentially got mowed down in the open ground after the abattis. The 7th South Carolina would report later 13 dead and 100 wounded, which is about 25% of their total force. The 8th South Carolina would report a similar percentage, about 25% casualties, which is quite significant. And the 8th South Carolina, an account later would state, Captain A.T. Harley, commanding one of the color companies, seeing the flag fall, seized it and waving it aloft, called to the men to go forward and take the breastworks. He too fell desperately wounded, shot through both thighs with a minie ball. He then called to Colonel Hennigan, he being near at hand, to take the colors. Snatching them from under Captain Harley, Colonel Hennigan shouted to the men to follow him, but he had not gone far before he fell dangerously wounded. Some of the men lifted up their fallen colonel and started to the rear. But just at this moment, his regiment began to waver and break to the rear. The gallant colonel, seeing this, ordered his men to put him down and commanded in a loud, clear voice, "About face, charge and take the works." Augustus D. Dickert, The History of Kershaw's Brigade. The 8th South Carolina rallies, but they largely can't move forward. They're pinned down by the fire of the U.S. troops from the breastwork. Even though a lot of those troops are 126 New Yorkers who are getting their first taste of combat, they have protection behind the breastwork. They can load their weapon under cover. They can pop over fire, pop back down. They're stiffening. They're doing well. Kershaw, seeing this, will send in the 3rd South Carolina. Colonel James Nance, he orders them pass over Colonel Aiken's regiment and drive the enemy from his works. Well, Nance doesn't order his men to charge right in. They move forward and pass over the 8th South Carolina, but as he says, I thought it unadvisable to carry the work at the point of the bayonet. The defenses look impressive. It looks like the defenders are there in numbers, and they're putting up a stiff resistance, but he sees that potentially the left flank of the position is vulnerable. If a force can get around that flank, they can turn the position and possibly drive the United States defenders from the breastwork. So he suggests that the 8th South Carolina should go around and get on the flank of this of the breastwork in order to carry the position. So he's not going to tell his men to run right up suicidally with their bayonets and try and get in there, but he's going to try to have another regiment outflank the position. Now on the other side of the line, the U.S. troops are doing pretty well. Their confidence is growing. They're behind a solid fortification. They have good cover to reload. They're able to fire. The South Carolinians have to come across this 100-yard open field, essentially, between the abattis and their position. So it does well. Captain Charles Wheeler, Company K of the 126 New York, he says the men were very cool indeed. As a rule, dropping behind the breastwork to load and then firing, and then rising and firing coolly over the breastworks. He's seeing good things. Colonel Sherrill starts to really feel it. As they would say today, he starts to feel himself maybe a little too much, and he gets up on top of the breastwork to encourage his men. Some of the smarter individuals in the regiment, in the defenders there, say, hey, you're going to get shot. You should come down, you're too exposed. Well, he replies, gosh darn, it's not a literal quote, gosh darn the exposure, no rebel ball can hit me. He sees the 8th South Carolina starting to make this flanking maneuver. He knows the line is threatened. He redirects 2 companies of his regiment, C and D, to try to meet it, to stop that action. Looks like this is paying off. But of course, he uttered those famous words that other officers would. General Sedgwick, John Sedgwick, later in 1864, said a similar thing at the Battle of Spotsylvania. He said the rebels couldn't hit an elephant at that distance. Turns out they didn't need to hit an elephant, though. They just needed to hit him, and they did. He was shot dead. A similar thing happens to Colonel Sherrill. Tempting fate is never a smart idea. He gets shot, hit through the jaw. It's not a fatal wound, but it's nasty. Drives teeth up through his tongue, top of his mouth, real bad. That ignites this cascading disaster because it's a nasty, nasty wound. A lot of the soldiers, and not just 126 New Yorkers, but a lot of soldiers are unnerved by that. So far, they've been doing pretty good. Casualties have been light since they have good cover, but then you see a guy get hit in a real nasty way, and some of the men start to break for the rear. At the same time, despite Sherrill having redirected some of his men to protect the flank, members of the 8th South Carolina are getting into position on the left flank of the defenses. And I do have a map of all this, which may be helpful. We can get it out real quick after this brief intermission. Our program can resume. So this is the initial movements of Barksdale and Kershaw. Barksdale commanding the Mississippi Brigade, Kershaw the South Carolinians. Kershaw is senior to Barksdale, so he's in charge of this whole thing. They're going to take Maryland Heights. And this is the more detailed version. So you see the 7th and 8th South Carolina. They hit an initial very small abattis, drive them back. That's sort of where the skirmish line is. And then they're trying to cross over this abattis and get over 100 yards to the breastwork. And they're having a heck of a time doing it. But Colonel Sherrill had been exhorting his men. Great example. People are taking inspiration, courage in his recklessness. He pays the price, getting hit, and then lots of bad things happen at once. Some of the men break for the rear, seeing that. Some of the flankers get around the left of the U.S. position, despite Sherrill trying to relocate men to shore up the flank. They get around the left. They're starting to fire down the line, which is way more dangerous than somebody trying to fire over the breastwork at you. Additionally, Barksdale, his Mississippians, they have been largely spectators, have not participated really because of how narrow the ground is. And at first, it's like there's no way we can get around to the left of the South Carolinians. It's just too precipitous. As we can
Down
see
here, right? Like all this down.
it's
the
like
side?
that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Not doing that.
Not ideal. We're not doing that today, and nobody's shooting at us. They're going to try and do that, and somebody's going to shoot at them. So, not a fun task, but sharp-eyed men find a trail. They can loop around and hit the right flank of the U.S. position. So as all this is happening, the left flank starts to get hit. Colonel Sherrill gets hit in the jaw, and then Barksdale's men start appearing on the extreme right flank. And that sets up for a pretty bad situation. There has not been a renewed charge at the front. It's not a complete disaster yet. It appears to some of the officers on the line, they're still holding out just fine. But Major Baird, the adjutant of the 126th New York, who has spent this whole time ducking and hiding behind trees, he sees that Barksdale's men are coming around the right flank, and he sends a panic message back to Hewitt here at the lookout, like, oh, they're getting on our flanks, we're screwed, essentially. And so Hewitt does not leave the lookout to go see for himself. He just sends a message, okay, everybody fall back. And it gets up to Lieutenant Colonel Downey between 10:30 and 10:45. And although Barksdale's men have started to come around the flank, although there's some South Carolinians on their left flank, there hasn't been a general assault with all of that driving them from the position. They appear to still be holding out. Some of the men have broken for the rear, but a lot of men are still standing there on the line. But he gets the order, and he replies, there certainly can't be an order to retreat from this position. He's aware that that's the key. That is their defensive, the main defensive position that they have created here on Maryland Heights. And also they haven't been driven from the works. They are still holding out there. So essentially he says, no, that's got to be wrong. Go back and tell me what the real order is. Hewitt orders again. A Lieutenant Adam Carnes goes to Captain Charles Russell this time. Maryland Cavalry, they've dismounted, they're helping. Russell says, hey, we've been ordered to fall back. So some of his men start to fall back, his men, and then it just spreads along the line. They see a couple units starting to move, and everybody else is like, wow, nobody wants to be last at the party here, so let's head out. Downey, upon seeing this, says, for God's sake, don't fall back. We must hold this position. But it's all for naught. The entire line retreats, headed back here for the lookout. Now around that time, Barksdale's men are in position to start assaulting the flank, and you have the South Carolinians who are rallying, and it was going to be bad. Today, few historians look back and say, yeah, they could have continued holding out indefinitely. No, probably not. Probably for not a whole lot longer. But at this point, the biggest thing is time. Colonel Miles is going to be surrounded. He has to hold out as long as possible until the relief column can get here. Somebody can come and bust him out. So the biggest thing that Miles can do in charge of the whole garrison, and that Colonel Ford can do defending here on Maryland Heights, is hold out as long as possible. Buy enough time for help to arrive. But this is not what happens. The general order to fall back happens. There's disorder, some panic, as men are flying back here to the lookout, and some of them going straight down the mountain. Now in this morning's fighting, the U.S. has suffered about 21 killed, 88 wounded, and 5 men were captured. So over 109 casualties, 5 men captured. Most of those are going to be in the 126th New York. They had about 16 killed, 42 wounded during the battle here. But they will be the ones who will be scapegoated after this battle, to sort of preview the end of it. Because by virtue of them just joining the Army, everything looks fresh. 126 New York on their caps is quite prominent, and they're the largest regiment here. So they're the most numerous. It doesn't mean that they're the only ones who retreated, who didn't wait for an order even, that just started leaking back immediately. But it means they're the most prominent, so they get all the blame. Now on the Confederate side, Kershaw's South Carolinians have 36 dead, 163 wounded, and then Barksdale has 2 killed and 15 wounded. So several hundred casualties in the morning fighting for the breastwork here on Maryland Heights. A significant battle. Now, back at the Naval Battery, as we had already discussed, Ford had pretty much given up before this battle up here at the breastwork had even begun. But right as the battle for the breastwork ends is about when Colonel Miles gets up there. He had received Ford's communication that the 126 are all straggling and everyone is falling back. He had received that a couple hours earlier, and then he had gotten on his horse and headed up to the Naval Battery. He encounters a whole lot of stragglers. Some of them are 126 New York soldiers. A lot of them are from the other regiments that were up here. And a couple of his aides, Lieutenant Willman and Lieutenant Binney, as well as Lieutenant Barris, will try to organize the men, stop them running, reform them. As Lieutenant Willman said, get them into some kind of ship shape after about an hour. They get about 500 men sort of calmed down, like, okay, we're going to go back up. Downey gets down there around that time on horseback. He's demanding to know who ordered them to retreat. Colonel Miles and Ford say, no one did. Go back up there and retake the breastwork. Which is real fun. Ford says the 126 New York will support you. It's like, okay, they were up there. A lot of them are now down here. But he heads back up to do what he can. There's a reformed line about 400 yards south of the lookout, so a little further that way. There's the Downey's 3rd Maryland Potomac Home Brigade. Most of them are still there. About 300 other men from various units. They've reformed, and they're going to go towards the lookout and see if they can get back to the breastwork. They'll advance with skirmishers out front. They get towards the lookout. They come into contact with some of the Mississippians under Barksdale. There's an exchange of gunfire, and then the motley crew, the other 300 men, along with Downey's, those 300 men, they just kind of disintegrate. Just a couple more shots, and they're like, yep, I need to be elsewhere. So start headed down the mountain. Downey tries to rally the men, but no success. They don't have their leaders, they don't have their unit integrity, they are just a disorganized mob. So they're going to go wherever they want to. And that's not forward, that's going to be backwards. So there are other officers who encounter some of the men, they try to rally them, nothing really is happening. Now Miles, earlier that day, had sent up another regiment to reinforce the 115th New York Infantry under Colonel Simeon Salmon. Some delightful consonants in that name. But he gets up to the Naval Battery around noon. So right around this time. He's got 630 men. A sizable force. You could potentially send the whole thing up the mountain, and that could be the backbone of an attack to retake the breastwork. They're pretty new, just like the other New Yorkers, but it could happen. Except Colonel Ford basically breaks them up, sends a few, 2 companies up to Downey, but then he sends 5 to a place called Unsell's Farm to cover against Confederate artillery. That's on a different side of the slope. They're not going to be used at all to try to retake the crest, the key of Maryland Heights. And then Colonel Miles and Colonel Ford are going to confer in their headquarters, and Miles' aide, Lieutenant Binney, is going to be there. We don't really know what they talked about. Colonel Miles, as we'll see later, does not survive the battle. Colonel Ford is under a ton of pressure. There's an inquiry after the battle. So he is trying to say whatever he can to save his own skin. And Lieutenant Binney is probably trying to protect his reputation as well. So we can't put much stock in what they talk about. But the best guess is that Colonel Miles told Ford to hold the heights as long as possible, but if they had to retreat, to do so and to spike the guns, those heavy artillery pieces at the Naval Battery. This whole time, they have been essentially useless in the defense, because they're halfway down the slope, as we know. You can turn those guns around, you can fire them up the hill, but getting them to land here and not down there turns out to be pretty difficult. And they didn't bring any of the other cannons up to this point. So the Naval Battery has been relatively useless, and yet Colonel Ford has hundreds of infantry down there, and he has all these cannon, some of the heavy guns, and 4 field pieces that he never released to come up here. One of the many conundrums of the Battle of Harpers Ferry. But the key here, again, is survival and buying time. Ford has clearly given up, as evidenced by his dispatch from earlier. He's in no condition to continue in command. He's certainly in no condition to be given discretionary orders that he can fall back if he needs to. But Colonel Miles has given him those orders. That's maybe Miles' most pivotal error in his command of the whole battle, is after Ford is already clearly defeated and given up, keeping him on the project. If somebody's decided it's impossible and they can't do anymore, then just let them go. Assign their work to someone else. And there's an interesting thing. There is a general here, Julius White. General White was in charge of the garrison at Martinsburg, about 2,500 soldiers. As a general, of course, he outranks everyone here on the United States side. But when he got here, he has a chat with Colonel Miles, and essentially he defers to Miles. The orders that they each receive seem to indicate that they want Miles to stay in charge here. They seem to. It's not very clear. One thing is there's no order writing class taught at West Point. It's all engineering. It's all math. It's all details about that. None of it's how to write clearly and concisely. And that rears its head many times during the Civil War. And it does here as well. But it seems like they're saying that Colonel Miles, since he's been here first, since he's been in the Army for 40 years, and White's just a volunteer who was appointed when the war began, that Miles should still be in charge. And White, as far as he said, basically took that's how he interpreted it. Here's the guy who went to West Point, who's been in the Army 40 years, I'll listen to what he says. But he got here late in the evening on September 12th, and Miles could have said, hey, your 2,500 men, just go straight here to Maryland Heights. You take over and make sure the Heights don't fall. As Miles had admitted, they were the key to his whole position. But he doesn't do that on the 12th. On the 13th, when he meets with Colonel Ford at the Naval Battery, and it's clear that Ford has given up, he doesn't take that opportunity either to say, hey, you know what, General White, I need you up here. And the commission later that investigates the battle, because it would be an investigation, they say this leaving the key of the position in the keeping of Colonel Ford with discretionary power after the arrival of the capable and courageous officer who had waived his rank to serve wherever ordered, that being General White, is one of the striking facts illustrating the utter incapacity of Colonel Miles. So, you have an opportunity potentially to put somebody a little more eager, who hasn't already given up, in charge, see what they can do. Miles doesn't do it. So, it's Colonel Ford who's just looking for an excuse to abandon the project entirely. Back up here near the lookout. By 1 p.m., Barksdale is advancing. He's clearing any remaining Federal soldiers here on the crest. Downey, he and his men are still trying to make a stand. He sends for reinforcements down at the Naval Battery. The request reaches Ford around the same time as reports that Confederates under Howe Cobb, who's on this map here, were advancing on Sandy Hook, the right flank of the mountain. Captain Charles Russell also gets down and says, hey, things are looking bad up there, because he and some of his men were still up here as well. So, how does Ford respond to this exigency? Well, the 32nd Ohio was short on ammo. They had requested more. Wagons of cartridges don't start up the mountain until 2:30 p.m. So, Ford sends to Miles, I cannot hold my men. The 126th all run, and the 32nd Ohio are out of ammunition. I must leave the hill unless you direct otherwise. No reply from Colonel Miles survived. It's possible he reiterated the previous order. Try to hold out if you can, but if you have to, retreat, spike the guns. So we got nothing, no reinforcements available. So whatever Miles replied, it got to Ford as far as we know around 2 o'clock, because then he said, you are hereby ordered to fall back to Harpers Ferry in good order. Be careful to do so in good order. And that order gets up to Downey. A short time later, by about 4 p.m., everyone left on the mountain has received the order, and they are coming down. They've abandoned Maryland Heights. At that point, Colonel Miles is out on Bolivar Heights, about 2 miles to the west, but he can see what's happening here through his spyglass, since there's a lot less mature trees, hardly any in fact. So he sees what's happening. He can see the stream of blue has become a river, and he exclaims, "God Almighty, what does that mean? They are coming down, hell and damnation." However, a little bit later, he meets with Colonel Ford after Ford's evacuated the mountain, after the guns are spiked, and seems to cool down. He's not yelling at him, he's not going crazy or anything. He seems to take it in stride. If we go back to Miles' temperament, his strict, literal following of orders, he's been ordered to hold Harpers Ferry to the last extremity. If he's lost Maryland Heights, well, you know, that's not Harpers Ferry. So is that a huge deal? Maybe not. But not everybody else agrees with that. The commission later said the abandonment was, quote, the surrender of Harpers Ferry. And then a reporter from the Boston Transcript was on Bolivar Heights at the time, and he said, "I could not but think they were marching to the funeral of Harpers Ferry." He said, quote, "Amazement filled their companions on Bolivar Heights. Mortification and rage possessed the officers." At this point, as it's getting late in the day, Miles knows that he has to try to hold out, that he's not going to get out of this trap because Confederates are coming from the south, they're coming from the west. So he gets Charles Russell, some of his Maryland cavalry, and he says, "Take 3 men, pass through enemy lines, and try to reach somebody that had ever heard of the United States Army, or anybody who knew anything about the United States Army, and report the condition of Harpers Ferry." And he instructs Russell, "Tell them that I can hold out for 48 hours. So Russell leaves. He and his men cut through Confederate lines, and they get to the Army of the Potomac, and General George McClellan in charge by about 9 a.m. the next day. That is September 14th. At that point, the Army of the Potomac had recaptured Frederick, Maryland, that way, and they were moving on South Mountain, where Lee had posted a rear guard. South Mountain's just about 10 miles north and east of here. McClellan sends a message to General Henry Halleck, who is in charge of all U.S. armies at the time. He says, "If Miles holds out, quote, even today, I can probably save him." As fate would have it, Miles would hold out the rest of the day. The Confederates arrived late on September 13th on Loudon Heights. Jackson's men come in from the west, from Martinsburg, and occupy Schoolhouse Ridge. To the west of here, just west of Bolivar Heights. For our final map of the day, make sure it's right side up. They then surround the U.S. troops on 3 sides. Jackson attempts an artillery bombardment on September 14th. At this point, he's 2 days behind in the program. As General Lee had laid it out in the Special Orders 191, this was supposed to take 3 days, September 10th to the 12th. It's now September 14th, and Jackson's men are still here. Jackson's in overall command of the whole operation. He's still here. The garrison is still holding out. He wants to try and shock them into submission. So he's going to have all his artillery batteries open up at the same time. McLaws, in overall command of all of Maryland Heights, he brings up about 5 cannon, 6 cannon here. General John Walker, who occupies Loudon Heights, he has 4 guns. And then Jackson, occupying Schoolhouse Ridge, has probably about 50 more. They are all going to open up. Jackson's choreographing this at around the same time, 1 o'clock on September 14th. A U.S. officer, Captain Edward Ripley, was looking up at Loudon Heights around 1 p.m. and he wrote that he saw 2, 3, 4, 6 puffs of smoke. And then the artillery bombardment had begun. He said when the shots started hitting Bolivar Heights that it became like, as he said, a disturbed anthill. A lot of these soldiers had never been in combat before this. They'd never suffered through an artillery bombardment, so they panicked. A lot of soldiers would write about, and war correspondents in every major American conflict, that artillery fire is uniquely psychologically trying. So this would be a lot of these men's first experience. So they panic a little bit. They're running back and forth, trying to find whatever cover they can. They keep having to move because there's shots coming in from 3 different directions. So the angles keep changing. But they attempt to hold out throughout the day, and they do. September 14th, the Stars and Stripes are still flying on Maryland Heights. And at that point, the campaign had been turned on its head. General McClellan, commanding the U.S. Army of the Potomac, he had found the Special Orders 191. Some of his soldiers had on the morning of the 13th, after they had recaptured Frederick, Maryland, 20 miles east of here. The orders had gotten to McClellan. McClellan knew that it was possible Lee's army was divided. It's possible that he could interpose his army between the divided halves of General Lee's army. And then he could destroy these little pieces that he knows, or that he thought could be still in little pieces, still divided. He had to make sure of that. He had to send cavalry out in the afternoon of the 13th. He says, go go toward Harpers Ferry. If you hear the sounds of battle in the distance, turn around and report to me immediately. Because that means that Harpers Ferry is still holding out. Telegraph lines are cut. They haven't heard anything from Miles since the 11th. But if there's sounds of battle, that means Miles is still holding out. That means that they could potentially move a relief force into position to come up toward the Pleasant Valley and the rear of McLaw's position here on Maryland Heights. So that direction. They could potentially get rid of McLaw's and open up an escape route for the other U.S. troops on Bolivar Heights and win an incredible victory. They could destroy significant portions of General Lee's army, and then General McClellan can get elected president in 1864, which he really wants to. So, the 14th, you have the battle at South Mountain, about 10 miles away. General McClellan's men push up through the gaps at South Mountain. They're getting close to the valleys on the other side. They are close to putting their army in between the divided pieces of Lee's army. Close to cutting them off from each other, close to winning an incredible victory. If they follow up their attacks on the morning of September 15th with aggressiveness and speed. If they're quick, if they're aggressive, they can do it. They can potentially liberate the garrison here in Harpers Ferry, save it from disaster, if they're quick and aggressive. Unfortunately, for the U.S. troops here, words used to describe General McClellan are not quick or aggressive. In fact, he's often described as slow and timid. Some of his subordinate officers, including General Franklin, who is commanding the relief force for Harpers Ferry, they take on qualities of their command. So they don't start launching assaults on McLaw's. They allow General Jackson to complete the surrender of Harpers Ferry that morning. They open the artillery bombardment again. They've relocated some of their troops, some of their artillery to the left flank of the U.S. position on Bolivar Heights, which is this movement here. General A.P. Hill is in charge of that operation. They've gotten into better position quickly. Colonel Miles realizes that if they let the battle keep going, it'll be a slaughter. They're preparing for an infantry assault. Miles doesn't have a lot of small arms ammunition. He's running out of artillery ammunition. So he confers with his fellow officers, and they agree they have no choice but to surrender the garrison. So the white flags are ordered to be run up, except, of course, nobody prepares white flags in advance. So Colonel Miles runs along Bolivar Heights, urging the men to wave. For God's sakes, wave whatever you have that's white. So tent canvas, handkerchiefs, anything that looks white, because there's a Confederate artillery in a 5-mile ring around Bolivar Heights. It takes time for their surrender to be communicated. There's a foggy morning on September 15th. It takes a while for the sun to burn off the fog. The guns are still firing for about a half hour. One of the final shots, fired from Loudon Heights, strikes near Colonel Miles, explodes, and tears off much of his left calf. It's a pretty nasty wound, and one he will not survive. By the next day, he died in his headquarters, the Master Armorer's house, in the lower town of historic Harpers Ferry. Whether he remains there to this day, I can't say. But that is where his life and his service to the United States ended. The garrison. There's over 12,000 U.S. soldiers remaining. There's been some casualties, a couple hundred. Confederate artillery and artillery in general in the Civil War just isn't very good. So there's not tremendous casualties on September 14th, and the infantry assault doesn't have time to develop on September 15th. So there's not mass casualties for the garrison. Most of the casualties, almost all of them, happened here on Maryland Heights. So over 12,700 U.S. soldiers surrendered. There were 1,500 cavalry here. They were able to escape. They got out of Dodge, cut through the United States or the Confederate lines on Elk Ridge, and they got out. 1,500 roughly horsemen saved themselves, but the rest of the garrison surrenders. It's the largest surrender of United States soldiers until Bataan and Corregidor in World War II. Now these soldiers, though, they would not be captured formally as prisoners of war and transported south to camps. Jackson now is 3 days behind schedule. Lee had actually already been urging him to disengage, and he's aware there's over 12,000 prisoners. That's too many to worry about, to provide for. Food, logistics, to transport them, not going to happen. So he paroles the men. They swear an oath on their honor and their life that they will not fight again unless exchanged for a like number of Confederate prisoners. Then they're made to stack their arms, and they are marched down through the lower town of Harpers Ferry out to the pontoon bridge over the Potomac River, and they march across. They go to Annapolis, Maryland, and following the terms of their parole, the bulk of the soldiers are then transported by the United States Army west out to a place called Camp Douglas near Chicago, Illinois. There, these soldiers are held for several months, essentially as prisoners. They are held in U.S. territory, guarded by other U.S. soldiers. Kind of an odd situation as we think about it today, this parole process. But it's relatively commonplace in the 1800s, and in the first couple of years of the Civil War, it continues. So Jackson essentially says, I don't have time for this, they're your problem. Which some people on the U.S. side would lodge complaints against. They feel like it's a cheap cop-out. If you can't manage the prisoners you've taken, have you even captured them? Really? Should we have to honor this? But essentially they do. It takes several months for the men to be exchanged. Many of them, including the 126th New York, would fight again. Colonel Sherrill would recover from his nasty jaw wound and would be commanding the regiment at Gettysburg, July 1st to the 3rd. On July 3rd, though, Colonel Sherrill gets his discharge in the form of a Confederate bullet, which is mortal. But the rest of the, he and the rest of the regiment will perform admirably. Up to that point, they had been called the Harpers Ferry Cowards for their role in this. They're scapegoated. They're the reason that Harpers Ferry surrendered. They're the reason that Jackson captured over 12,000 men. So they got scapegoated. But after Gettysburg, they would be the Harpers Ferry Cowards no longer. They would redeem their honor. The soldiers, though, of the U.S. garrison are not the only ones who are captured here in Harpers Ferry. There are others, perhaps as many as 2,000 African Americans who were living in Harpers Ferry at the time of the battle. They, for the most part, were escaped enslaved people who had liberated themselves from the local area and had made it here. If they got here, they could have some measure of freedom. By the summer of 1862, the United States Army had made it official policy not to return escaped enslaved people to their former enslavers in the Confederate States. So if they got here, they could potentially be free. They could potentially find work for the U.S. Army. And there were as many as 2,000 here when the battle began. Colonel Miles didn't let anybody flee across the Potomac River into Maryland. No civilians, none of the self-liberated people, no one. He didn't want to cause a panic, so nobody's allowed to leave. They are here as the garrison fell, as their only guarantee of freedom goes away. A woman living here at the time, Abba Goddard, the matron of Clayton General Hospital. Clayton General Hospital is today's Lockwood House. She said that when the garrison fell, the human hyenas came to Harpers Ferry. She said that men, women, and little children in droves were carried off. Southern soldiers, slave catchers, came to Harpers Ferry. And sometimes the enslavers themselves from the local area showed up looking to claim what they had legally defined and called their property. These people, these refugees of freedom. So as many as 2,000 are captured here, and they are re-enslaved. The Richmond newspaper wrote about carloads of those people arriving in the city for sale. Their former enslavers in this area had no longer deemed them trustworthy. They lose their freedom. But out of this campaign comes hope for those people. Hope in the form of the Emancipation Proclamation. This campaign culminates with another battle 2 days later, September 17th, upriver and across at Sharpsburg, Maryland. About a half-hour drive away, or a less than 8-hour march away, as A.P. Hill's men would make that march on the day, September 17th. The battle is climactic, tremendous. The United States Army of the Potomac, with over 80,000 soldiers, launches waves of attacks against the Confederate Army. At this point, due to the constant campaigning, the strain, the various battles they had fought throughout the summer, General Lee's army, which had been 70,000 men, is probably down to something like 37,000. There are a good 10 to 20,000 men just somewhere between Sharpsburg and Leesburg, Virginia. They're all over the place because they've been campaigning constantly. He's driven the wheels off of his army. He tries to make a stand to salvage the campaign at Sharpsburg. That's where he decided to rally his troops. Since the U.S. Army had caught up, since the Battle of South Mountain, he knew that they had to concentrate somewhere closer. Not Hagerstown, but it's got to be closer than that. Sharpsburg stuck out on the map. There's bluffs overlooking the Antietam Creek, maybe a good defensive position. So he holds up the rest of his army there. Jackson's forces join him, McLaws and Walker as well, over the next day and a half. And on the morning of September 17th, the U.S. Army starts launching waves of assaults against the Confederate defenses. They attack throughout the day. By the end of the day, the battle lines are relatively in the same position. Some of the U.S. troops under General Burnside had gotten across that bridge that bears his name today, had gotten up onto the flank of the Confederate position, but just at that moment, A.P. Hill's men, which were still here in Harpers Ferry, he had a total force on paper of about 5,000 in his light division. They arrive on the battlefield just at that moment. In the nick of time, they blunt Burnside's assault across the bridge, and they save the Confederate line from disaster. But by nightfall, Lee understands that his army has been driven to the breaking point. And if he stands and the battle is renewed the next morning, he could be a disaster for his army. So when McClellan doesn't immediately attack the next morning, he reorganizes his men and starts to pull back. They'll cross the Potomac River at the Shepherdstown Ford. There'll be a small battle there on September 19th as the U.S. Army tries to catch them as they're heading over the river. They're not wholly successful in that, but there is a battle there as the Confederate Army slips away. The campaign will come to an end. This is the first campaign in the Eastern Theater in Virginia in which the Confederate Army is forced to retreat. The United States wins a huge strategic victory. Tactically, the Battle of Antietam is indecisive because they don't drive Lee's army from the field. It's incredibly bloody. Over 23,500 men are killed, wounded, or declared missing in action after that single day's fighting. It's the bloodiest day in American history. But strategically, Lee's campaign is over. He has to return to Virginia. He can't win that big battle in the North and force Lincoln to the negotiating table. In fact, Lincoln feels that now he has the cards, that momentum has swung in his favor. He's going to capitalize on that by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. This document declares the enslaved people in the rebelling states will be henceforth and forevermore free if those states do not rejoin the Union by January 1st of 1863, 3 months later, 2.5. That document, in the very near term, does not do much to end slavery in America. It applies only to states currently in rebellion. They are in rebellion. So the people in those states who enslave others are not listening to what Abraham Lincoln has to say and go, oh, okay, you're the president. So they don't free their enslaved people for the most part. In the United States, states that remained in the Union that allowed slavery, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Emancipation Proclamation doesn't apply. They're excluded. In areas currently held by the United States Army as of September 1862, like New Orleans, Louisiana, doesn't apply. So it doesn't free a bunch of people immediately. But what it does do is two things. One, it expressly commands for the first time the United States Army to recruit and train African American men as soldiers. By the end of the war, close to 200,000 African American men would serve in United States colored troop regiments. Additionally, what it does, the biggest thing is it reframes the whole focus of the war. Up to this point, the Civil War is being fought to preserve the Union. That's Lincoln's only stated goal. That's why he wanted people to sign up, join the Army in April of 1861 when the war broke out. Save the Union, preserve the Union. But as one U.S. soldier said, Walter Stone Poor, a New Yorker, he said, of the old Union we have had enough, and more than enough. By the summer of 1862, many soldiers and Lincoln himself are convinced that to end the war, slavery has to die with it. So this document will make the war now about ending slavery, about not remaking the old Union, but making a new Union, and perhaps a more perfect one in which slavery would no longer have a place. It would take several more years of fighting to get to that point. It would take Congress translating the Emancipation Proclamation into a constitutional amendment, the 13th Amendment to our Constitution. But that would be passed in early 1865 and would go into effect after the war ended. And that would result in some 4 million people who had been enslaved when the war began, would result in their freedom after the Civil War. Harpers Ferry would manifest this dramatic revolution. It manifests the whole tremendous cost of the Civil War. The town changes hands 8 times over the course of the conflict. The Harpers Ferry battle is a disaster for the United States Army. It's a disaster for the people of Harpers Ferry. The town changes hands continually. In July of 1864, there's another battle here. The town is bombarded by heavy artillery, including a really big gun, which was emplaced a little further down the trail. So the town suffers greatly. By the end of the war, it's a ghost town. Out of 2,500 to 3,000 permanent residents, maybe a couple hundred are left. But also, in the town is something new. The industries have been abandoned, but a school was founded at the end of the war called Store College. A school which existed to educate newly freed people. It was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read or write in Virginia before the Civil War. In 1865, as this is now West Virginia, this is still Maryland. Harpers Ferry is now in West Virginia, and there is a school founded to do just that, to teach those who were once enslaved the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, to teach them how to enter into the promise of a new birth of freedom, as President Lincoln had promised. And Harpers Ferry plays a role in all that. Also in 1864, the 19th United States Colored Troop Regiment marches through Harpers Ferry. They go by John Brown's Fort. So this place, its role in the Civil War continues throughout, and it manifests the dramatic changes in making a new, more perfect Union as a result of the war. You folks have any questions? Thank you so much for coming with me this far. If you want to keep going, I'm going to keep going along this trail. Go by the 100-pounder battery. That's the really big gun they brought up, 9,600 pounds. Just the tube. Go by that, go down past the 30-pounder battery to finish up this Blue Blaze trail. And then it's a red blaze down to the overlook, which I'll take in the view, maybe eat a little bit, and then head down the mountain. If you feel like you've had enough, and you want to head more directly down to Harpers Ferry. If you go back the way we came, that's the most direct route, going down back this Blue Blaze Trail back to the Green Blaze. Just make sure you take a right when you get to that intersection, and you'll keep heading down the mountain. But otherwise, I thank you so much for joining me. Hope you enjoy the rest of your time here in Harpers Ferry.
Thank you. Thank
This would be your sunrise.
you. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.